It's been 4 years since Satellarknights were first released in Duelist Alliance, and I think that for the most part, they've pretty much fallen off the map entirely in terms of competitive play. Even at the lower tables at regional qualifiers, I don't really see Satellarknights anymore, and that's not too surprising. I mean, there's only so much time in the world, and there's only so many players, so obviously not every single deck is going to be played at every single event. But for a very long time, especially the first year after this set was released, the Duelist Alliance set, Satellarknights were commonly seen at top tables all across tournaments as sort of like the Altergeist of 2014 and 2015, which is really cool. And if you don't know what the Satellarknights do, basically they're all level 4 monsters, and they make some pretty crazy rank 4s. Specifically, the on-themed ones are pretty crazy, but the main core elements of it is that you use Satellarknight Deneb to search Satellarknight Altier, and then you can loop that combo over and over and over again. And then they play a variety of trap cards like Phoenix Chain, or I guess now they play Phantom Knight's Fogblade and Call the Haunted and things like that, because they have their boss monsters, Satellarknight Triver, that can bounce everything back on the field to the hands, so you can reuse those sort of stun cards. And this was actually one of the most hyped decks of 2014 after the WCQ, more hyped than Burning Abyss and Shaddolls, which is pretty crazy to think about. But if you go back to the first like 2 weeks of Duelist Alliance, pretty much all the tops were from Satellarknights. People had not figured out how to play Shaddolls, and people hadn't figured out how to build Burning Abyss decks. So Satellarknights, which is a pretty straightforward deck that even if you do a lot of weird stuff with the ratios, as long as you have the core Satellarknight monsters, Deneb and Altier, it really can't go that wrong. But what you might not know if you weren't playing back then is that there's actually a weird variant of this deck that saw a ton of experimentation, even by players such as Aaron Furman at YCS Toronto that year. Obviously, Aaron Furman does not screw around with decks. He really knows what he's doing, a very well accomplished player in Yu-Gi-Oh! So yeah, even players like that were trying out this new weird variant of Satellarknights with burn cards, which is pretty crazy and not what a lot of people would expect of that deck. And in today's video, I want to talk about the history of this specific variant of Satellarknights, why it was good for a short period, and also why it eventually fell to the wayside. So let's jump right in. What's important to know about the rise and fall of the Satellarknight Burn strategy is that while all of us do have sort of this backlog of Yu-Gi-Oh cards in our mind that we keep going back to, older cards that whenever we see a newer card we say, hey, maybe this will work with this newer card, while we do have those backlogs of those older cards, whenever you see two cards next to each other, it is a sort of surreal experience where you go, hey, maybe these would work together. And I mention this because part of the reason that Satellarknight Burn was even thought of to be a strategy was two cards from Duelist Alliance. And I say this because many people do buy packs, or they get packs for their regional entries or YCS entries. People tend to open the newest sets even if they're not really someone that buys boxes. They just sort of come across the newest sets at all sorts of events. Not only do you get them for entry packs for regionals and YCSs, but also if you go to locals, many local stores back then did give the newest set as your entry pack. And I mention this because these two cards probably wouldn't have been thought of if they were released like a year or two before Satellarknights, although one of them is a Satellarknight, so it's a little tricky. But just in general, I think it is important to note that the reason this deck was even thought of was because these cards were released in the same set as the core Satellarknight monsters. So the first one is the level 4 Satellarknight monster that does 1,000 burn damage, and this is probably the most important part of kicking this strategy off in a lot of players' heads, because if this card didn't exist, Satellarknights would have a much harder time actually burning the opponent. But this card's pretty crazy, and you'll notice I'm not trying to say its name because I don't know how to pronounce it. I will willingly admit that I have no idea how any of those letters go together to make a sound. But this card is really good. It does 1,000 burn damage on summon, which is actually quite a bit of damage. It's 1/8 of your opponent's life points. And keep in mind that in Satellarknights, you can play all the cards that I just mentioned. You can bring this card back with Altier to do 1,000 damage. You can bring this back with Call the Haunted to do 1,000 damage. You can repeatedly do 1,000 damage every single turn, and that can put your opponent on a pretty short clock, especially when you can sort of compare it to a lot of decks in that day. Burning Abyss and Shaddolls, while they are fast, they're not extremely fast, not up to 2018 standards. So a deck like this could kind of slow roll the opponent, especially considering it had so many trap cards in there to stop the opponent's play. So the main goal of a Satellarknight player was to slow roll the opponent and then incrementally do this 1000 points of burn damage. But I think maybe even more important than this was the common trap card release in Duelist Alliance that I personally saw a lot of copies of. I opened a lot of Duelist Alliance. This was a card I was very familiar with, and that is Battleguard Howling. If the 1000 damage Satellarknight monster was not enough to really secure burn Satellarknights in players' minds, I think Battleguard Howling was the biggest impact. And the reason I say that is because this card is so clearly designed to work with Satellarknights, and it's in the set of Satellarknights that a lot of people just naturally tried it out in that deck and had moderate success. So this card says when a warrior monster you control is targeted for an attack or by an opponent's monster's effect, which is actually really neat, target one face-up monster your opponent controls, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the original attack of the face-up monster you targeted with this card, and if you do, return to the hand. So this card isn't quite Magic Cylinder. I know a lot of people will say, well, Doug, you always knock on Magic Cylinder. This card isn't quite Magic Cylinder because it doesn't actually require your opponent to attack. They can also just use a targeting monster effect, but more importantly, this thing doesn't have to target the card that used the effect or the card that attacked. It can target any face-up monster your opponent controls, and then it not only does burn damage equal to the attack points, but it also bounces it back to your opponent's hand. That's a lot more than what Magic Cylinder does, which is why players like Aaron Furman, a very well-known player, decided to play a card like this at a YCS, because this isn't just Magic Cylinder, it's more like Magic Cylinder plus Compulsory Evacuation Device plus sort of like Skill Prisoner, which is a lot of stuff for one card. So that's like the main thing here, but we also have to think of the format that people were playing this card in, because one of the things that a lot of people that didn't play during that late 2014 format, I guess there were two formats there with Shaddolls and Burning Abyss, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that the game changed forever there. I've already made an entire video about it, but one of the things that changed a lot was that the game was suddenly really focused on floating effects. Burning Abyss and Shaddolls monsters all replace themselves when they go to the graveyard, which wasn't really found in Yu-Gi-Oh! That often before then, or at least not in the meta decks. While there were cards that floated into other monsters when they went to the graveyard, nothing on the level of Shaddolls and Burning Abyss, which meant many decks, including Satellarknights, often just got outlasted by Shaddolls and Burning Abyss because their cards didn't float. So what Battleguard Howling did and what the Burn Satellarknight strategy as a whole sort of accomplished is that you don't really have to worry about outvaluing your opponents if you just burn them. And that, it sounds crazy, and some people might be saying, well, it doesn't apply to 2018. Not so much, because there aren't really as many floating effects in 2018. I mean, the Gokis are obviously like that, but they're not really like playing the same way that Shaddolls and Burning Abyss would. I mean, the win condition of Burning Abyss in 2014, that first set, Duelist Alliance, was pretty much just to not die. That was the first time that we really saw that as a major win condition in a competitive strategy. So by using burn cards, your opponent could have 5 monsters on the board that float when they die, but if you just burn your opponent to death, then it doesn't actually matter, and that was a huge appeal factor for the Satellarknight Burn strategy. Now I know it kind of sounds like I've gushed and gushed about this deck being so good back in the day, but obviously this did not become the standard version of Satellarknights, and you might be asking yourself, well, Doug, why is that? And it's actually a pretty straightforward answer. Burn cards in general just aren't very good. These cards are all minuses in card economy, and even the Satellarknight that just does 1000 damage, that card isn't a minus in card economy, but it's not a plus either, and the whole reason that Satellarknights were even played was because all of their effects were basically +1s. Deneb's a +1, Altair is a +1, all these effects are +1s, so when you have a card that's sort of like a do-nothing card in your deck that just does 1000 burn damage, that by itself isn't that powerful. You need other cards to support it. You would open hands that would just be like multiple Battleguard Howlings, you only have like one monster, and then your opponent would kill it, and then you couldn't use Battleguard Howlings, they're all just completely dead. So pretty much the downfall of this strategy is exactly what you would expect if you've watched any of my videos talking about why life point dealing damage cards really just aren't good in competitive play. They simply don't do enough by themselves to make a big impact. Card advantage just in general is infinitely more important than life point damage, which is a huge deal for a deck like Satellarknights, where the main selling point is that the deck gets +1. So even though this deck had a decent matchup against the metagame, it eventually fell out of favor because just playing normal Satellarknights with normal trap cards in them ended up being a lot more consistent over the course of a longer tournament. Now that's not to say this deck never topped anything. It got a couple tops in the first couple months of Duelist Alliance, but eventually people just stopped playing this deck, and then when decks like Cliff Wards came to the metagame, obviously this deck got even worse. Yeah, Cliff Wards do sort of burn themselves, but this is really good against floating effects, not so much just Cliff Ward monsters being normal summon and attacking you for game. So Battleguard Howling and the Satellarknight Burn deck as a whole never really saw a ton of competitive success other than those first couple weeks with this set. However, I do think it's cool to talk about this deck because it's one of the first times that we've really seen a burn deck come out of a deck that's not really meant to be a burn deck. We don't see that too often. Even a deck like Trickstars doesn't usually win by burning you. I know a lot of newer players that get into the game or see Trickstars for the first time wonder why Trickstar players aren't playing cards like Gift of Greed to do damage with Lycoris, or even cards like Dark Room of Nightmare, whatever, that does 300 more effect damage. But the fact of the matter is, Trickstars aren't really a burn strategy. It's not how they beat competitive decks. They're a strategy much like Satellarknights that just incrementally get a lot of pluses, which is really, really good. They just happen to have burn effects built in, which is good. It's not that those burn effects don't matter. It's just a case where if Trickstars all they did was burn the opponent, pretty much no one would play them. It's just that they already have good +1 effects, very similar to Satellarknights, although in the case of Satellarknights, you had to actually add the burn cards to the deck, therefore the deck didn't become that competitive. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoy this discussion on a deck that saw play for a couple months and I don't see a lot of people talking about. I think decks like this pop up every once in a while, specifically when there's like a card in a set that isn't an archetype card, but could work with some of the archetypes in the set. I think that's when people are most likely to actually try out those crazy combinations, which is pretty cool to see. Thank you guys so much for watching though. I'll see you later. Bye.